Good evening. I'm Julia Pierce from the Camden Public Library. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. On behalf of the Camden Conference and the Camden Public Library, I would like to welcome you to one of our very last Camden Conference community events of the season. Since September, libraries throughout our state have been hosting free online programs such as this one, exploring various facets of this year's Camden Conference theme, the geopolitics of the Arctic, a region in peril. An outstanding array of speakers have offered us unique perspectives into the world's least known regions. Topics discussed range from climate change to indigenous populations, to architecture, to natural resources, and to commerce. In tonight's program, Politics and Policies in the Arctic, we will hear from someone who is an advocate for Maine's and the United States' interests in the North Atlantic and Arctic region. Maine's first independent United States Senator Angus King is co-chair of the Senate Arctic Caucus and a member of both the Senate Armed Services Committee and the Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Senator King will be joined by our moderator, Susanna Hancock, a specialist in global intractable conflict and Arctic policy. She has also been an integral member of the Camden Conference Community Events Committee and Education Committees. If you have any questions for Senator King tonight, we encourage you to type them into the Q&A box, which is located in a toolbar at the bottom of your screen. We will do our very best to get to as many questions as we can. We also ask that you do keep your questions related to the Arctic topic. We will be recording tonight's program, so if you enjoy it and you would like to share it with someone else, we encourage you to find it later on the Camden Conference website, as well as the Camden Public Library website. Without further ado, I would like to now turn the program over to our moderator, Susanna Hancock, and our very special guest this evening, Senator Angus King. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia, for that introduction, and welcome, Senator King. Thank you for joining us this evening. It's nice to see you again, and we're
great to be with you, Susanna. Great to be with you, and great to be back in Camden, if only virtually.
Yes, well, we're very pleased for you to join us this evening as we come toward the end of our 2021 Camden Conference season. So going over the flow this evening, you, Senator, will speak for 20 or so minutes, I believe, after which we'll launch into a discussion, during which time we welcome questions from the audience. I know many of the audience members here participated in the Maine February conference and were joined by some regional experts and many curious individuals. So please get those thinking caps ready. As Julia mentioned, those questions can be sent to me using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. And with that, Senator King, the virtual stage is yours. Thank you.
Great. Hey, Susanna, thank you so much. And I got to say, U.S. senators are often put in this position of speaking to audiences where the audience knows considerably more about the topic than I do, but I'm going to do my best. First, you introduced me as the co-chair of the Arctic Caucus in the Senate, and there's a funny story behind that. I was very interested in Arctic policy when I first got to the Senate, in part because of Maine's position, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But anyway, I was walking into the Senate chamber right behind Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, and I said, Lisa, I want to be the Arctic senator. And without missing a beat, she turned to me and said, no, Angus, you can be the assistant Arctic senator. And so she's the boss, but she and I have been working on these issues pretty much since I got to the Senate now almost 9 years ago. And it's an amazing area. And I've got some slides that I'm going to share, but first I want to give you a little bit of background. Because of climate change and what's happening in the climate of the Arctic, think of it as discovering the Mediterranean Sea. It's a body of water that hasn't been available for much human use other than by the indigenous people for at least 25,000 years. All of human history, recorded human history. And it's an amazing experience that we're living through right now to have this essentially new ocean becoming available for transit, for energy, for tourism, for new forms of economic development. It's a radical change in sort of the the geology of the planet, but also the geopolitics, and we'll talk about that. It's not possible to talk about the Arctic and what's happening without a little diversion into climate change. So I've got a couple of slides, a few slides I want to share. Let's put up the first one that gives us the kind of perspective as to where we are in this world-changing event. What you're looking at is about 1 million years of history. And the squiggly line on the graph is the amount of CO2 in the atmosphere. And if you look, it varies between a low of about 160 parts per million and goes up around 250 to 280 parts per million. And it varies over time. You'll often hear people talk about climate change where they say, well, it's only part of a natural cycle. Well, what this chart shows you that over the last 1 million years, there has been a cycle, but then when you go out to the far right-hand end of the chart, you see that we're almost literally off the chart, that we're up over 400 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, and you can see what a huge variation that is from the norm of the last 1 million years. The last time we were at 400 parts per million, and actually we're now at like 420, which is amazing because it was only 400, I can remember 5 or 6 years ago. But the last time we were at that level of CO2 in the atmosphere was 3 million years ago, and the oceans were 60 feet deeper. So that gives you a flavor of why we're having this discussion. I don't think there are too many people out there now that are saying that this isn't happening, that climate change isn't happening. And when you see a chart like this that shows you the dramatic variation from the 1 million year up and down, it really makes the point of how serious this is. So what does this mean? What happens? Let's go to the next slide, and it'll give you an idea. And I think this is a fascinating slide that I ran across 3 or 4 years ago. This is ocean depth, and the time frame on this slide is only 24,000 years, not 1 million years, 24,000 years. And on the left is the low point, and that it says last glacial maximum. That was when the glaciers covered Maine. Maine and much of North America were covered with 2 miles of ice. In fact, it's been in the last few years that Maine has stopped rebounding upward because of the retreat of the glaciers. So what you see there is that the ocean was 390 feet shallower than it is today. Today is on the far right of the graph. And the line is essentially the depth of the ocean. So the 0 is up on the upper right-hand corner, minus 390 feet is over to the left. Now, to put that in perspective, you could walk from Camden to Vinyl Haven. I checked the chart just a few minutes ago. You could walk from Camden, and a walk to Islesboro would be nothing, because the water in Penobscot Bay until you get further out than Vinyl Haven and North Haven is shallower than 390 feet. So that gives you a perspective. So now what happened was the glaciers melted. And as the glaciers melted, the fresh water flowed into the ocean and the sea level rose. You'll see in the middle of the graph, there's a place called Meltwater Pulse 1A. And the reason that's significant, that happened about 15,000 years ago. And what's significant about that steep rise is that that represents about 1 foot a decade of sea level rise. 1 foot a decade of sea level rise. Now, a lot of people are talking about what's going to happen to sea level now. And they say, well, 6 inches, a foot, a couple of feet. I know responsible climate scientists who believe that we may well be in a significant meltwater pulse 1A kind of moment, where we could see a foot of sea level rise a decade starting a little bit later in this century. And of course, if that happens, you're talking about 6 to 8 feet by the end of the century, which would be catastrophic for many parts of the world. Our coast is principally rocks. You could say goodbye to our beaches, but the rocky coast, it would certainly influence Maine, but it wouldn't be the disaster that it would be in areas of the country like Louisiana or Florida or many parts of the eastern seaboard. So Meltwater Pulse 1A it got my attention. The other interesting thing about this chart is if you look over to the right, you get to about 8,000 years ago, and it pretty much flattens out. Well, 8,000 years is recorded human history. And what that tells us is that the sea level has been pretty consistent for essentially all of recorded human history, which means we think that's the way it's always been. Excuse me. We think it's always going to be the way it was. But what this graph tells you is that not that long ago, it was drastically different. So times can change, and they are changing before our very eyes. Let's go to the next slide. This is the Arctic sea ice minimum volume between 1979 and last year has been reduced by 75%. Let that sink in for a minute. 75%. This isn't a little, small blip in the volume of the ice. It's not down 5 or 10%. It's down 75% in volume from where it was just 40 years ago. And that is what leads us to the next slide, which is what's happening to the Arctic Ocean. And one of the reasons that we're talking about this is the opening up of this enormous area of water to commerce and to trade. And what you see on this map are 3 different Arctic routes, one of which is in somewhat substantial use today, the one on the left that's called the Northern Sea Route that runs essentially along the Russian shore. And then the route on the right, the brown line on the right, is what's called the Northwest Passage. And as you can see, it runs along Alaska, Canada, and then down between Canada and Greenland. And I'll stop right here and say, why does a senator care about the Arctic, a senator from Maine? Well, let's go to the next slide, and I think it might suggest something to you. This is the route of a cruise ship that went through the Arctic 2 or 3 years ago. It started, as you can see, in Alaska, went around through the Bering Strait and through the Northwest Passage. And look where the first stop is, Bar Harbor, Maine. And the northern route over the pole, one way or the other, is substantially shorter than any other sea route from Asia to Europe or North America. The Suez route, I think, is something like 14 days longer for shipping. So this area has an important potential in trade. And guess where the ports are, where you would first come to the continental United States if you're coming over the pole. The first port is Eastport, then Searsport, then Portland. And so that's one of the reasons that I'm so interested in this, not for the next few years or maybe even the next 10 years, but in the long run, I see this as part of Maine's future. It's back to the future, really, because Maine was always a seafaring state. And we're already seeing those kinds of developments in Portland. Ameskip, the Icelandic shipping company, has made their North American home in Portland, and we're seeing a huge increase in trade with what they call the High North, with Iceland and Scandinavia. I see that as only increasing as the Northern Sea Route or the Northwest Passage becomes more and more usable. Now, every year, the time that they say this is going to be feasible seems to shorten. 4 or 5 years ago, they were saying 30 years. Now people are saying 20 years, and it's happening so fast. As I showed you, the the decline of the sea ice is dramatic. And in fact, you can see it on this map. The gray area was the ice extent in September of 1985. You see that on the left. And then the white is the ice extent in September of 2015, and it's smaller now. It's essentially shrinking almost before our eyes. And now I do want to pause here. The melting of the Arctic sea ice does not raise the sea level. You put if you drop a cube of ice in a Coca-Cola, the level goes up. But as it melts, it doesn't change the level because it's already displaced the water. The key here is Greenland. There's about 20 feet of sea level rise in the Greenland ice sheet, which is melting like crazy. There's about 212 feet of sea level rise in the Antarctic ice sheet. You can think of Greenland and Antarctica as the last remnants of the glaciers. And what they're doing now is they're both melting. I just read a headline today that an iceberg the size of Manhattan Island just broke off of Antarctica in the last week or so. And that's what's good, is when that water that's frozen, that's locked up in those ice sheets, when that enters the ocean, that's when sea level goes up. Of course, the other thing that makes sea level go up is as the water itself warms, it expands. That's in the nature, that's in the chemistry of the water. Okay, let's go to the next slide. We talked to the title of this program says something, I think, about geopolitics. And this is a disturbing slide. What you're looking at, you're looking down on the North Pole with Greenland to the left, Alaska and Canada on the left shore, and Russia on the right shore. And what you see, all those little boxes are Russian military bases. Now, to be sure, we have some bases too, but nothing like the volume of what you see, and many of those are new. And that's a concern. And it's hard to tell. I've studied this, and my perception is that most of these facilities, these military facilities, are defensive. But it doesn't take much to turn a defensive airfield into an offensive airfield. And there are a lot of airfields on that map. So that's a sort of a preview of the geopolitical situation in the Arctic Ocean. So okay, we can. Those are the slides. I hope that's been illustrative. So let's go. Let's talk a bit about what this region, what opportunities this region presents. One, as I mentioned, is clearly trade. And as I said, the route over the North Pole is generally shorter and faster, and therefore cheaper for shipping than either the Panama Canal or the Suez Canal going east to west. So I think that's bound to help to develop shipping lanes in the high north. I went to a conference in Iceland several years ago on the Arctic, and it was a wonderful conference, and there were people there from all over the world. But you know, the Arctic nations, Scandinavia, Russia, Canada, the U.S., but there was a huge delegation from China. And I asked one of the organizers of the conference, so how come they're here? Well, they're very interested in the Arctic, and they have denominated themselves a near Arctic nation. And I laughed and said, well, that means Maine is a near Caribbean state. I mean, you know, they're nowhere near the Arctic, but the point is they're interested in the Arctic. And that is something that should tell us something about the potential up there. So it's an enormously important area for trade and commerce. Energy exploration is a possibility, although, you know, going back to my chart about CO2, I'm hoping that we don't need to do fossil fuel extraction, certainly not in the Arctic, given the danger. But that's an opportunity. The lives of the indigenous people are being changed dramatically. The people who have depended upon hunting and sealing, and many of their villages. I talked to Lisa Mikowski. Many of their villages are literally falling into the Arctic Ocean, and they're having to move whole villages inland. So it's a dramatic change in human history that's occurring right before our eyes. So it is a very important area of the world. My introduction to the Arctic was, I think, the first year that I was in office. I was invited by the Navy to go to Alaska. We flew to Alaska. We flew a small plane out over the ice, landed on an airstrip built on the ice on the Arctic Ocean that was black garbage bags made the runway. And there was an experimental station there doing all kinds of research. And a couple of hours after we got there, a nuclear submarine burst up through the ice. And myself and the rest of our delegation ended up spending a couple of days on that submarine, 2 days, I think it was 2 days and a night, under the ice. We then submerged and went under the Arctic ice. And that was my real introduction to the Arctic region. Since that time, I've been to Greenland, I've been to Iceland a couple of times, as I mentioned. I've been up to Baffin Island in Canada, and certainly been to Alaska several times. Let me end these comments before I get to questions on Greenland. I have a sort of a philosophy that you can't really understand something until you see it with your own eyes. And 3 or 4 days in Greenland was a real eye-opener. As you fly across the ice sheet, you see these giant holes in the ice that are called moulins. And into these holes are flowing massive rivers of blue meltwater. And they're going all the way down through the ice sheet to the rock underneath, lubricating the rock, and that's helping the ice to slide out into the glaciers and as glaciers into the icebergs. We went to the Jakobshavn Glacier, which is retreating dramatically, and it was really an amazing sight. And the Greenlanders now are seeing land where they've never seen it before. And for them, they're gaining, farmland and pasture land that they haven't had in the time of human habitation. So it is, we're seeing dramatic changes. It's very important to this country. I think it's very important to Maine. I want to see Maine be a participant in this development. And it is something that, the climate change, we can spend the rest of the time talking about climate change and how serious it is. But this is an effect. My talk tonight isn't, what we need to do about climate change. If there are questions on that, I can certainly go into that. But this is what is. This is a reality. And to go back, I guess, to the beginning, that meltwater pulse 1A is what keeps me awake at night. Because if we get into a situation where the ocean rises a foot a decade, or even a foot every 2 decades, it's going to be enormously expensive. It's going to have huge impacts around the world, and it's going to have a huge national security implications, which is one of the reasons I've worked so hard on the Arctic in the Armed Services Committee. So I'll stop there and be glad to answer questions. I hope this is helpful to put it in a little bit of context as to what's going on up there and why.
Well, thank you, Senator King. And certainly the degree of climate change in the Arctic is outstanding. I mean, you mentioned being in Greenland, and in my experiences, to put that in numerical terms, Greenland in 2019 lost the equivalent of 6 Olympic-sized swimming pools in water or in ice each second for the entire year on average. So if you think of how much water that is, and that's the meltwater per second for an entire year. And we talk about with the Paris Accords wanting to keep temperatures below 1.5 or 2 degrees centigrade. In the Arctic, because of various feedback loops, et cetera, that might be 8 degrees. So
Yeah, we've already lost that battle in the Arctic. The Arctic
we've lost
is
that
heating
battle,
up.
exactly.
Yeah,
And
it's heating up faster than any place on Earth right now. And
exactly.
by
And
the
so
way, the Gulf of Maine is the second fastest warming body of water on Earth.
yes, directly related in part to the melting of Greenland and changing of the Atlantic currents, the Labrador Current, and the desalination that's then acidification in the ocean affecting our crustaceans. And
Well,
right?
Susanna, you mentioned the currents. I don't know if you saw it. There was an article just in the last week or so about the disruption of the Atlantic currents. And I've always thought that may be the most scary piece of potential climate change impact. If the Gulf Stream is what makes the British Isles and Scandinavia habitable. If something happens to the Gulf Stream, and it's changed over the millennia, but if the Gulf Stream shifts or stops because it takes so much heat up to the northern latitudes because of what's happening with all the fresh water coming out of Greenland and the Arctic, that could be catastrophic for Northern Europe. And when I say catastrophic, I'm not being hyperbolic.
You mean catastrophic, exactly.
Yeah.
And the stories, the other stories in the papers, and friends of mine who are in Siberia and Alaska right now talking about the liquid, the fuel LNG ships that are going through the Northwest Passage, Northern Sea Route right now, which is the latest they've been able to go ever that we know about. So.
And the Russians are making a lot of money. The Russians charge several $100,000 to allow those ships to go through there. That's right. It's a money maker. It's like they're like the Rhine pirates from a couple of hundred years ago.
Well, it's a money maker, but it also changes the dynamics. You mentioned China as a near Arctic state. I mean, we've got Singapore that's an observer state to the Arctic Council, and Singapore is what, 1 degree off the equator, right. But it sees itself as part of a player in shipping and economy. And so, get these countries aligning with Russia because they want that trade route. Russia's charging them. That it gets into those global politics and new relations.
Well, one of the problems, Susanna, and I know you know this, is that the basic piece of infrastructure in the Arctic isn't a highway, a bridge, or a railroad. It's an icebreaker. And we have 1.5 heavy icebreakers, period. We have the Polar Star, which is a real icebreaker, and the Polar Sea, which is basically being cannibalized for parts to keep the Polar Star running. The Russians have something I've seen varying numbers from 30 to 45 icebreakers, including half a dozen nuclear icebreakers. So they have, for a country that doesn't have an economy anywhere near the size of ours, they've decided this is an important investment for them. We are now building 2 new icebreakers, but the problem is they're going to come online about the time the Polar Star and the Polar Sea are beyond saving. So they really aren't new icebreakers. They're simply replacements. This is a real lapse in American policy, in my view.
Looking at that question of militarization, obviously Russia is highly militarized in the Arctic, and there's a lot of talk whether it's likely or not about sort of a new Cold War. And I know you've spoken in the Arctic about if you want peace, prepare for war, and have put forward the Arctic Naval Focus Act. Can you talk about the role of militarism? How does that jive in a region that's always been peaceful?
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the Arctic Council. The Arctic Council is a kind of geopolitical association of countries that border the Arctic, and it's heretofore its history has been very productive and very collegial, but it explicitly does not deal with military issues. That's outside of the scope of what the Arctic Council tries to work on. So the question is, can we, remember I talked about discovering the Mediterranean Sea, can we discover this new ocean and deal with the utilization of the resources and the trade routes without conflict? You know, the Mediterranean Sea was a site of conflict for 1,000 years. And the question is whether we can do that in the Arctic, whether we can manage this transition in a way that doesn't involve military conflict. That's not going to be easy. On the other hand, we have institutions and like the Arctic Council that can help. One of the problems with our participation in Arctic geopolitics is the failure of this country to ratify the UN Law of the Sea Treaty, so-called UNCLOS. Every military person, every State Department person that I've talked to, and I asked the question, you know, at hearing after hearing, everyone says we should do this. And the reason we should do it is that we're not at the table. Russia is staking claims in the Arctic to where their territorial waters are, and we're not there to contest because we have refused to ratify the treaty for years. And it's, as I say, every national security person I've ever talked to thinks it's something we ought to do, you know, we should have done 10 years ago. I'm hoping we're going to be able to try to bring it up again this year and see if maybe some minds have been changed, because all we're hurting is ourselves. And we're basically, as I say, we're not at the table where these decisions are being made. We're not participants. And that's harmful to U.S. interests in my mind. And that's, you know, that's another sort of geopolitical aspect of this region.
Do you think this region is going to become more of a priority for the new administration? Not just looking at the geopolitics, but looking at the impacts of climate change or the military, oil, gas, exploration of resources?
I think it will. I think I was about to say if Dan Sullivan and I have anything to say about it, it will. Dan Sullivan is the other senator other than Senator Murkowski on the Armed Services Committee, and he and I are both on that committee, and we sort of bounce back and forth as to who's going to raise the Arctic issue this week. And we always, and so I think there's a growing awareness of the importance. We have more interest in our little Arctic caucus than we had before. And I think we do need some new infrastructure up there. There's no serious port on the Arctic side of Alaska, and they're talking about developing some infrastructure at Nome, I believe, to remedy that problem. I hope it, you know, like I say, I have no desire to militarize it. I don't think that's the direction we should be going in. On the other hand, we have to take cognizance of what the Russians are doing and try to determine what their intentions are. But as I say, I think we're in a place where we hopefully can manage the competition so that it doesn't turn into conflict.
Can you talk a little bit more about other legislation when you have the Arctic Senate Caucus, maybe a little bit about what that does? I know you're interested in raising issues that relate to the Arctic in all of the bills that you bring up, as many as you can, and certainly in the committees in which you sit. But are there current acts of legislation in the Congress at the moment relating to some of these Arctic issues?
One that a major victory was a year or two ago when we finally got the icebreakers authorized. That was a big deal, and it took a lot of pushing and hauling with both senators and a small group in the House. So, and by the way, I mentioned we have that one major heavy-duty icebreaker. It goes between the Arctic and the Antarctic every year. So a good deal of time it's churning through the Pacific Ocean without, you know, doing its job of ice breaking. I mean, it's just an indication of how weak that piece of our infrastructure is. So I think that we need more icebreakers, and particularly because our route, that is the route of the Northwest Passage along Alaska and Canada, is not as free of ice as the northern route, the Russian side. So icebreakers are going to be more important on our side of the North Pole, and so I believe that's something that we need to. We can't just settle on two. I think we need more because if we want to participate in the opportunities, particularly for shipping. As far as fossil fuels are concerned, I suspect they're up there because they're certainly present in Alaska. But I believe that we're on the verge of getting away from fossil fuels in a big way. In my opinion, the real Green New Deal is storage. Wind and solar power are already competitive and in fact can beat almost any fossil fuel in terms of price. The problem with those renewable technologies is intermittency. That is, you know, if the wind doesn't blow, the windmills don't turn, and when it gets dark at night or a cloudy day, you don't get the same amount of solar energy. You get none at night. So the question is, where does the energy come from to fill in the gaps? Heretofore, in many parts of the country and in New England, it comes from natural gas. Natural gas still generates about 60% of the energy in New England. But if we get to a place where renewables can be backed up by some type of storage, battery, a grid scale battery, or other kinds of storage technology, and there's a lot of research, then I don't think anybody's going to be interested in drilling for oil in the Arctic because there's not going to be the economic return to justify the high level of expense of drilling in that kind of environment. Now, there are lots of things you can do with oil other than burn it. Petrochemicals, plastics, all of those kinds of things. But I think we're at a place where the economics, and in fact, this is happening. We're all concerned about drilling in ANWR, in the Arctic National Wildlife Refuge, which I've consistently opposed. At the time of the major Trump tax cut in 2017, there was a little thing stuck in that bill, which I opposed, and a lot of us did, that opened up ANWR to drilling. I'm not current on it, but I suspect that they're not going to have many bidders at the current level of oil prices, just because it's an expensive place to extract fossil fuels, and the price just isn't going to justify it. So there's concern, and my concern is if we do go into extracting the fossil fuels, that it be done safely because of the harsh environment. It's a very tough environment, and then you get to the geopolitics of it. What if we have all the controls and the rules and the regulations and the safety measures, and the Russians don't care, and they just drill? And so that's where we need to strengthen the international institutions and the areas of competition, but also of cooperation in order to do that kind of thing safely.
Wow, that's quite an answer. I've got several things that I want to follow up with that. One is obviously the issues in the Arctic. I mean, you mentioned drilling and problems that can go wrong, oil spills, things that we can clean up to the extent that we can clean up elsewhere in the world are really hard, if not impossible, to clean up in the Arctic.
Right.
And
Bigelow Lab, by the way, in Maine is doing some research on that.
Yes.
On the difference between cleanups in a frozen country versus the Gulf of Mexico.
Yes.
Very different environment.
Very, very different. And obviously the Arctic lacks a lot of the infrastructure. So if there is an issue that you've got to bring in everything. And that's another issue with the Northern Sea Route and Northwest Passage, not having the navigation, not having the charting and the ports, etc. So that was one thing I wanted to bring up. And another was, can you talk a little bit, we were mentioning storage and batteries, renewable energies. A lot of these involve mining and for components and minerals. And those mining in the Arctic, we've got a lot of indigenous populations. Yeah. We tend to mine on their land. We have a question about the regulation of some of this. What can we do about the protection of indigenous populations in the Arctic that relate to our activities?
Well, I think we got to be very cognizant of that. Environmental justice is a real thing. And we can't simply offload our environmental problems to someone else, particularly indigenous peoples. And that's got to be that's got to be a major consideration. I know I was just talking to a colleague today about a major mining project that's being proposed in Alaska that's right on one of the most important sources of salmon. So Here's the thing, Susanna, and I've I've done wind, hydropower, biomass, conservation. I've been in the energy business longer than I was in the, well, maybe not quite as long, but just about as long as I've been in public service. And what I found is there's no free lunch when it comes to energy. There's no magic solution that everybody says, oh yeah, that's what we should do. Everything has a cost, everything has an upside and a downside. I used to work on development of hydro projects, and people said, don't ruin our rivers. Why don't you do wind power? And then, like a fool, I went and did some wind power, and they said, oh, don't ruin our mountaintops, do more hydro. So, that's just the reality. And what I know is, as I say, there's no free lunch. There's nothing that doesn't involve costs. Now, to me, though, the imposition of those costs on innocent people like the indigenous people is not a acceptable trade-off. And yes, there is going to have to be mining. It should be carefully controlled. I don't want to, I was about to say, I don't want to be quoted on this, but I know this is being recorded, so that's a vain hope.
Being quoted.
But we haven't changed our hard rock mining law for like 150 years. It goes back to the 1880s, and I think that's, we've got to, if mining is part of our future in order to support renewables and alternative energy sources, then we've got to figure out how to do it safely and in an environmentally sound way.
Thank you. And just to pick up again from your previous answer, one other thing I wanted to bring up when you're talking about the UN Convention to the Law of the Sea. Can you talk about why the US hasn't joined that?
Yes, the short answer is there are a lot of people, mostly in the Republican Party, who don't like treaties. They view a treaty as an abrogation of US sovereignty. I think they're mistaken. A treaty is an extension of US interests. And yes, it imposes obligations on the country, but it also imposes opportunities. And UNCLOS is a perfect example. And by the way, I think we should quit calling it UN. We should get rid of UN because that has political weight as well. Just let's call it the Law of the Sea Treaty. But there are people that view it as a limitation on sovereignty. I've always thought about it this way. I don't know if you ever thought about this, but a stop sign is a limitation on your sovereignty. It's a limitation on your God-given right to drive straight through that intersection. You put up with it in order to have some assurance that when you do go through the intersection after having stopped at the stop sign, you won't get killed. So you're giving up some of your freedom, your sovereignty, if you will, in order to obtain something that's of equal or greater value. And the Law of the Sea Treaty is a perfect example. Yes, we would be subject to it, but yes, we would then be at the table to force the Russians to abide by it as well. And I view it as a positive, but there are people in the Senate, and it goes back years, that just don't like treaties. They view treaties as a eating away of U.S. sovereignty, when in reality, I think it's more something that yes, it does limit our freedom of action in whatever the area is, but it also gives us some protection. We have a nuclear arms treaty with Russia, which we're just about to renew, and it limits our ability to build all the warheads we want, but it also limits the Russians' ability, and it helps to make us safer. So that's the argument. Frankly, I think these people are wrong, and that's why I say we're going to try to make another run at it, I hope, in the next couple of years. But it's a sort of article of faith among some politicians.
On that note, can you expand a little bit about some of the blocs that are forming, either aligned with Russia or coalitions forming among the Arctic states?
Well, that's a really good and interesting question. In my role, particularly on the Armed Services Committee, I occasionally go to these international conferences. I went to one in Halifax about a year ago, and was at one in Singapore. The one in Singapore was very interesting because I had something like a dozen what they call bilaterals, which were meetings just between myself and top defense officials from a whole variety of countries, mostly in Asia. And what I realized, what struck me there, is that the US has allies and China has customers and Russia has customers. They don't have allies. And allies are one of the most important assets that we have that I don't think we take full advantage of. In fact, one of my differences with the former President Trump, and there were many, but one of them was that he wanted to go it alone. And confronting China in terms of trade, I think, was the right thing to do. What was the wrong thing to do was to alienate all of our natural allies before doing that, and then doing it just for us. Sanctions are much more effective if they're multilateral than if they're unilateral. And so allies are one of our real assets. And Russia has, they have some sort of client states, but they don't have the allies that we have. And I think it's a great advantage to us. Churchill once said that the only thing worse than fighting with allies is fighting without allies. And it's one of our major foreign policy assets. We just had a hearing this morning in the Armed Services Committee with two experts, H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor, and a Dr. White, I believe, expert on foreign policy. Allies was a big part of their testimony and how important it is to us.
Speaking about allies, can you talk about as these northern routes, shipping routes open, as the Northwest Passage opens, how might the US's position on Canadian sovereignty in the waters off the Canadian archipelago, Arctic, need to evolve?
Well, again, to me, it's the kind of thing you negotiate. It's the kind of thing that you settle. And waterborne boundaries are not easy. We had to go to the U.S. Supreme Court when I was governor to resolve where the island that Portsmouth Naval Shipyard sits on is located. And as you know, there were cases that I think went to the U.S. Supreme Court about where the boundary is between the water boundary between Maine and Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. So these are thorny problems that involve fishing rights and mineral rights and transit and all of those things. But that's why you have organizations to try to resolve those issues, to negotiate those issues. And I think that's the way it's got to be solved. I'm not prepared to now say where the line should be, but I think that's the challenge, Susanna. That's the challenge, is to resolve those kinds of issues peacefully through negotiations and acceptance of the outcome, rather than have it lead to conflict, which is historically, conflict is what ensued over boundary disputes.
I think the Arctic has done quite well as a region. I mean, we've got Hans Island between Canada and Greenland, and a little bit in the Beaufort Sea, and a border between Russia and Norway, which wasn't really settled until 2010, but it does seem to be an area in which we're pretty peaceful. And even the Hans Island, Canada and Greenland, they're pretty entertaining with how they debate that one.
Well, let me make a prediction though, Susanna.
Yes,
as the
please.
stakes go up, the negotiations won't be as easy.
I think that's a very fair prediction. Yes. And as the stakes go up, I mean, the Arctic Council, which is this body that started in 1996, partly to maintain the peace and negotiations in the Arctic among the 8 Arctic states, but it rotates its chairship every 2 years. And when it was in the US back in 2016, they held the senior officials meeting in Maine, which was a fun opportunity for Maine. But yeah, and I'll come back to that in a moment. But
guess who's the chair this year?
Right, well, I was about to ask you about that. So it's Iceland right now, but we'll be heading to Russia in May. What anxieties do you have, should you have, as not just you yourself, but as an American looking with US-Russian relations, Russia's obviously going to have a different focus than Iceland, than the US.
Well, as I mentioned, the Arctic has been an island of comity in a sea of competition. The Arctic thus far, and the Arctic Council has, I believe, been quite productive and quite, the relationships have been good, and we've been able to work successfully with the Russians. But as I say, one of the reasons that's the case is that military matters are excluded from the jurisdiction of the council. But I don't expect great changes with Russia taking over the leadership of the council. I certainly hope not. I've been to council meetings before. I went to one up on Baffin Island several years ago with Lisa Murkowski. I'm hoping that we're going to be able to maintain that more pacific kind of relationship and have it not escalate. And by the way, I suspect you've been there, but anybody that's listening, a wonderful place to visit is Iceland. This is apropos of nothing, except I've been to several Arctic meetings there and the Arctic Circle meetings, and it's just a spectacular country, and it's pretty easy to get to, and it's a place you ought to be on your list.
Highly recommend. So, can you speaking of Russia, obviously it's made a lot of its GDP policies about oil, and and Arctic obviously presents resources which it's wanting to extract. How can we look at environmental issues with Russia without the economic base?
It's tough. It's tough, but it's one of the reasons that, I mean, I believe one of the great challenges will be working with Russia on the regulation of energy extraction in the Arctic. As I mentioned earlier, we can have all the regulations in the world and be as careful as we can be, and the Russians can say, well, we just want to get the oil and gas out and not be burdened by these expensive regulations. Somehow we have to communicate with them that it's in their interest, as well as ours, as well as Canada's, as well as Scandinavia, to take care in this. But I think that's one of the looming issues, is a kind of, and maybe we ought to have an environmental treaty or an environmental agreement or a memorandum of understanding about how we're going to approach those issues in terms of safety. Because as you mentioned, the issues of an oil spill in the Arctic are very different than they are in the Gulf of Mexico. They're bad anywhere, but it could be much worse in the Arctic because of the climate and the circumstance. So I would hope that would be an area where we could try to work with the Russians and convince them, as I said, that it's in their interest as well as everybody else's to not pollute and destroy the wonderful resources that are up there.
That might be something, looking at a country like China as well, with their interest in the Silk Road, and we've got the Middle East that's interested in the Arctic more for the resources. Can you talk a little bit about China? I mean, would they talk, the Polar Silk Road? What is their intent? Can you speak a little bit more to that?
Your question, what is their intent?
What is their intent?
That's a question that I ask at practically every hearing with China experts. In fact, I even asked Henry Kissinger that question. What does China want? And I think that's a very important question for this country to ask and try to be answered. We have to, let me digress just for a second, because it came up in the hearing this morning. One of the problems with American foreign policy, in my view, is that we don't understand the history and culture of the countries that we're dealing with. And we tend to think that everybody on earth thinks like us, that they're the same, have the same mentality, the same values, the same kind of linear way of thinking. And that's not true. And quite often we can make terrible mistakes by not understanding our competitors or our adversaries. And one of the, General McMaster this morning said, we have a narcissistic foreign policy. That is, we think it's all about us. And he said, we need a more empathetic foreign policy. I'd never heard that term before, but I think that's absolutely true. And so when you talk about China, we have to try to understand, what is it that they want? I think they're interested in the Arctic principally for trade, because it's, as I mentioned, 14 days shorter to go over the top than it is to go through the Suez Canal or the Panama Canal to get to markets on the eastern seaboard of the US or Europe. So I think that's their principal interest. They may have oil and gas exploration interests, but I think their principal interest right now is trade. And I don't think they have any military interest in the region, and I hope that continues to be the case. But you know, I think it should tell us how important the region is, that a country that's so much further away from it than we are is taking such an intense interest in the region.
Thank you. And we've just got a couple minutes left, so I want to bring up a couple more questions topics that have come up in the questions. But Maine's relation to the Arctic. Maine is obviously part of the US, which is an Arctic country, but we don't relate to the Arctic, I guess, it's not really necessarily part of our state identity, but if you look at the country, Maine is bisected by the 45th degree parallel, which is halfway between the Arctic, the North Pole, and the equator. We have 4 states that are north of the 40th.
There used to be a restaurant, I think it was in Dexter, the 45th Parallel Diner.
Exactly. So how do we, I mean, we see the effects of the Arctic, the melting ice, et cetera, all the time with the storm, winter storm 2 weeks ago that knocked winter storm warnings for 170 million people in this country, and still dealing with the effects of that with climate change. You know, you are one of the senators on the Arctic caucus, having the Arctic Council meeting in Portland. I'm Skip in Portland. What is Maine's relation to the Arctic? How should that be? Should we have a sort of a sub-state policy, sort of like
we do. We have an actual office within the Maine International Trade Center. I think it's called Minado. Yeah. Dana Eisness, who's extremely capable. And I think she realizes, and the state realizes, that we have a long-term interest. And it's in a variety of areas, but to me, the most obvious one is our ports. And that we are the first stop in the continental United States for a ship coming from Asia to the East Coast. And that could be part of our future, to become the port, and then whatever the objects are or the product is, it can then be shipped by rail or other means down the East Coast. So I think that's part of our future. I mean, Maine was one of the shipping capitals of the world. You drive along coastal Maine through Camden and Wiscasset and Bath and Rockland, and you see these grand white houses, and they were built by ship captains. They're a product of the golden age of sail that was part of Maine's history. And I think we have an opportunity to return to that kind of important orientation. Let's face it, one of Maine's largest assets is its coastline, is the access to the cold North Atlantic, the not so cold Gulf of Maine. And trade is part of that, and it can produce benefits for us, I think, for the next generation. So that's one of the reasons that I got interested in the Arctic, because I see, and it's not something that is going to happen while I'm in the Senate, but it's going to happen eventually, and I want Maine to be positioned to take advantage of the opportunities.
And Maine has the deep water ports, which, you know, looking at Alaska, where there's the deep water port excavation in Nome, and we just put what $618 million toward that, and all the concerns over that, and yet in Maine
I was with Bobby Peacock. I was with Bobby Peacock in his boat in Eastport, and we were as far as from you to the back wall of your house from the shore, and there were 65 feet of water. The Port of New York, they would kill for 65 feet of water. They're spending billions of dollars to get to 50 feet. The deep water port that we have at Eastport and the port facility in Searsport and then Portland are all natural assets. And there are proposals to expand Eastport or to develop port facilities near Calais. But this is what we have. I mean, if you were the CEO of Maine Inc., the first thing you do is take stock of your assets. The first asset is the wonderful, capable people that we have, but then you have the forest and you have the ocean. And those are tremendous assets that we should be, that they should be integral to what we view as the future of the state. Now, and the other asset, by the way, is that it's a wonderful place to live. And not to stray too far from the Arctic, but we're moving into a moment of history where people can live where they work, can work where they live, and they don't have to live where they work. And that's a huge change. And if we can maintain the quality of life and the environment that we have in Maine, I think we have a real future. Look at what's happened this year. The number of people from along the East Coast that have bought houses in Maine, that came up to Maine in March and stayed through the rest of the year. I think we're going to see a long-term trend toward people coming into this state as long as we maintain it as the attractive place that it is. If you can work anywhere from home, why not have your home in a nice place? And Maine certainly meets that criteria.
Yeah, well, I'm very glad when I've been working from home this past year that I've been in Maine. So,
there you go.
Yeah. And on that note, I'm aware it's 8 o'clock, so I do want to wrap up. I do want to ask one question that we've had quite a few people ask, and it should be a pretty simple answer, but icebreakers. So we have a handful of people wanting to know whether they speed up the breakup of the ice or the melting of the ice. Can you just address that one question and then we'll move on?
No, I don't think they have anything to do with it. It's the temperature that's breaking up the ice. The icebreakers, most of the rim of the Arctic Ocean on the Russian side or the U.S. side, the ice is already breaking up, and the icebreakers principally push the ice aside in order for a ship to go in. But you may know more about this than I do, but I've never heard of anybody suggest that an icebreaker does anything to contribute to the diminution of the ice. That's all about, as you mentioned, the temperature. I mean, what was it a few months ago? It was 60 degrees in the Arctic, or it was unbelievable. And then of course there are the feedback loops as the tundra melts. Methane is released. Methane is 80 times as potent as CO2 as a greenhouse gas, and that makes it worse. If I took some pictures when I was in Greenland. In fact, I was just looking at one the other day, and as you look over the ice sheet, it looks sort of blackish. It looks like somebody's peppered it, and the dark color is soot that's come from all over the world, and that's making the ice melt faster because of the dark absorbs more heat from the sun. So no, I don't think icebreakers contribute to the loss of ice in the Arctic. It's all about the climate change.
Yeah, that's my impression as well, that it's a pretty negligible breakup that is subsumed quickly. And so last question for you, what is one thing about the Arctic that keeps you up at night?
What keeps me up at night, I think I touched on earlier, and that is that the change of the climate and the amount of fresh water that's coming out of Iceland and what that may do to the North Atlantic currents. I think that may be one of the most underrated risks in terms of climate change. And I was at the northern, I'm trying to remember, I don't remember what it's called, but there's a research center at the University of Maine at Orono that's works on ice cores going back thousands of years from Greenland and other places. And they used a word in my discussions that I'd never heard before with regard to climate change that really sort of shook me, and the word was abrupt. We tend to think of climate change and geologic time as being hundreds of thousands and millions of years. But remember that first graph that I put up that showed the meltwater pulse 1A, the water was rising a foot every 10 years, and that's abrupt. And so what worries me, what does keep me awake at night is the danger of something abrupt happening that would really be catastrophic. And the currents, I've thought this for years, that the currents in the Atlantic, particularly the Gulf Stream, the Labrador Current, are we don't realize how important they are to stabilizing the climate of the Northern Hemisphere, and what would happen if something occurred that would change those currents. And this huge influx of fresh water out of Greenland and the change of the salinity, as you know, is a very sobering prospect. On that high note, can't we end up on something? You and I could, I think we need to maintain our interest in this area. We need to be aware of the issues, but I also think we need to be aware of the opportunities. And I think there are opportunities for Maine, and that's certainly where I intend to focus my efforts.
And we have there was a question about this as well that we didn't get to, unfortunately, but we've got some great institutions in the state. When you mentioned the Climate Change Institute, UMO, we've got UNE North, Bigelow Labs,
Monado.
We've got a lot of groups that are looking at sustainable development in the North in relation to Maine and climate. So there's a lot going on, and a lot to which we can be hopeful, but there's also the warning that came out.
And it's March, spring is coming.
And it's March, yes. Although I've been involved with the IPCC this year and getting the note last week that the country's plans that have been put forward only contribute to 1% reduction in greenhouse gases. So we've got a long way to go, but a lot of opportunities. So
well, we do, but I think the acceleration of the development of renewables, the electrification of automobiles, if we can principally do renewable electric generation and then electrify our transportation based upon that renewable energy source, that's 2/3 of the source of greenhouse gases right now, transportation and electricity. And you can put those together. And I just think we're on the edge of some real breakthroughs in things like storage, but also what is becoming the ubiquity of solar and the generation of wind. Offshore wind has huge potential. We have to work out so that we don't have conflicts with the fishermen. I think that can be done. So there's a lot of opportunity in front of us, and I think the Chinese word for crisis, I think it is two characters in it. One of them is danger and the other is opportunity. And I think that's the way we should look at this. There's danger, but there's also opportunity, and we need to do everything we can to reverse that first graph that shows the CO2 going into the atmosphere. But we also need to figure out what the changes are and how do we anticipate and accommodate ourselves in order to have a good life for our children and grandchildren.
Yes, well, on that note, lots to think about, and God, it sounds like we've got our work cut out for us for sure. So Senator King, I'd like to thank you very much for the stimulating and thought-provoking discussion this evening. And I'd like to thank the audience this evening for the fabulous questions and contributing to that discussion. I've had several questions that we couldn't get to, but quite a few that we did, so I'm glad about that. I also want to thank outgoing and incoming Camden Conference presidents, Matt Storin and Karen Look, and conference staff, Kim Scott and Lauren Lewis. Senator King, your team, and especially Caroline Cullen, who's running the slides in here tonight. And
she's great.
She is wonderful, yes. And also Colin Kelly for running the tech show this evening. Before we go though, I do want to remind everyone that our final event of this year's Camden Conference Arctic season is taking place on Monday, March 15th at 6 p.m. So that's 2 weeks from yesterday. And it's in conjunction with the Belfast Free Library presenting the documentary Frozen Obsession. And this will be screened later on PBS, but it details an 18-day, 2,000-mile Northwest Passage project expedition to study the consequences of climate change. And you can wait to see it on PBS later in the year, but if you join in March, you'll be able to speak with the film producer, David Clark, as well as Bryce Luce and Ed Struzik, who were the head scientist and science writer, both of whom were part of the voyage. So with that, Senator King, thank you very much. Thank you for everybody who was here tonight, and good night from Maine.
Good night. Thanks, Susanna. Great to be with you.